Today on Living History, it's Janet Yang.
We needed so many extras. We took whole giant work units to work for us. And then when Steven arrived, I was pretty much stuck by, in a good way. Kathy said, "You do not leave Steven's sight." So I suddenly found myself in this unbelievable position to be with one of the greatest living directors in China, on the set in Shanghai, where my father was born.
Today on Living History, we're speaking with the acclaimed film producer Janet Yang. Janet's career has bridged Hollywood and China. In 1986, she worked on Empire of the Sun with Steven Spielberg and Christian Bale. That was the first major Hollywood studio film produced in Shanghai since China's reopening, a groundbreaking experience that gave her a front row seat to one of the earliest collaborations between American filmmakers and the Chinese film industry. Janet has built an extraordinary career in the film industry. She has championed stories that cross cultural boundaries. She has helped bring Asian and Asian American voices to global audiences. And until just now, she was the president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, where she continued her work to expand the global reach of cinema and to nurture the next generation of storytellers. We're very honored to have you with us, Janet Yang. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
So, Janet, I said in the intro already, Empire of the Sun was the first major studio film to be shot in Shanghai after China's opening in 1979. But projects like that don't happen overnight, right? And something that complex takes a lot of preparation. And so it must have been all the more difficult because it hadn't been done before. So I would like to know, how did this project come about? And maybe take me back to the day you got the call.
Yeah, okay. I may have to take you back further. How is it that I got that call? Why me, right? So should I take you all the way back?
I will take you to 1972 as well.
Okay, that's what I was thinking, because that's where it all started. I grew up in a white community on Long Island where my parents had moved because they heard the schools were good. I knew very little about China growing up. China was not recognized yet, obviously, by America or by the United Nations, where my mother worked. So she, as a Chinese citizen, was allowed home leave every other year, which took us to Taiwan and Hong Kong. Taiwan was considered the China. And I took a number of trips and, enjoyed them, but didn't feel much. And then one day in 1972, she came back from work and said, "You're not going to believe this. We are being invited back to China." And, both she and my father, I tear up thinking about this, were unintentionally separated from their relatives for decades, for 35 years or so. So they obviously longed to see their relatives. They never imagined that they would be apart for so long. They left as graduate students in the late 40s. And shortly after they arrived in America, the regime changed. The program under which they came under, which was subsidized by the government, was shut down. So they, in a sense, were refugees and scrambled to figure out what to do, whether to go back to China, stay in America. In the end, they chose to stay, and so I grew up kind of oblivious to China. They would say to us, "Oh, in our lifetimes, we may never be able to visit China, ever, but hopefully in your lifetimes." So I had this kind of vague idea that one day, maybe, I'd be able to visit China. But now in 1972, with Nixon and Kissinger's visit to China, and a kind of officially opening of sort of a new détente relationship, they were encouraging us. The then UN ambassador from China gathered all the Chinese citizens and said, "We really encourage you to go back. You probably miss the motherland. We promise you'll be safe," because it's hard to describe what U.S.-China relations were like at the time. I mean, the only real equivalent would be North Korea. And China had been cut off from the rest of the world for, very, very severely for quite some time, which is why my parents didn't think it would ever be possible to visit again. So suddenly this opportunity arose, and while many of the friends were afraid to visit, my mother in particular said, "I have to see my family. I just have to take advantage of this opportunity." So, but there were still some precautions taken. Like, for instance, they didn't think our whole family should go back all at once because just in case, what would happen? So they decided to split us up. So my mother and I took the trip initially, and then my father, older sister, and brothers went after we came back. And that was really a life-changing trip for me because, first of all, I got to experience China at that time. It was a very, very specific time, as you can imagine. And I got to meet my dozens and dozens and dozens of relatives for the first time, and it really left a very strong impact on me emotionally and in every way. I was just so stimulated to experience a country that was so entirely different from anything that I knew. You know, it was very poor at the time. It was very, very communist in terms of military music blaring all the time, a lot of military personnel everywhere in the street. So in some ways very intimidating. They told me not to take pictures, that we were clearly being followed everywhere. But there was also something underneath that was very, very enticing to me, just learning about the country, the history. China in 1972 was nothing like what it is today. It was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, as everyone knows. The only way to get into China back then was to fly to Hong Kong and then take a train to the border and walk across this rickety wooden bridge, and then you're on the other side. And, you know, instantly you were met with, again, military music, military personnel, just very severe, I would say. It was very, it was very serious. And given that we were coming from abroad, of course, we were novelties, we were being watched, et cetera, et cetera. But through it all, our relatives, dozens and dozens of relatives met us in Guangdong, and they basically followed us around, and, everybody spoke in whispers. They didn't want to really talk about what happened to their family unless we were in kind of a public place. And so clearly there was still a lot of fear and intimidation, but there was also something that I took away, which was just a kind of warmth being around relatives and a fascination with a country that had transformed so much since the time my parents left, and just learning about it. So anyway, that set the course. That 3-week trip set the course, that curiosity that was engendered at the time, both to understand China in a broad sense, politically, historically, and also to understand it on a more personal level, like what it really meant for me to be Chinese, and the fact that we almost moved back to China, that I probably would have been a Red Guard, and all the kind of sliding door moments that came to mind, like what if. So it just engendered so much curiosity that later when I went to college, I decided to study Chinese studies. Again, I had no professional aspirations. I really had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up, much to my parents' chagrin. But in Colleton, I studied Chinese studies, and it was right after I graduated when U.S.-China relations were normalized, and then I heard about students and journalists and business people suddenly going to China officially, and I wanted to be among them. I just thought, if I want to know about China, I have to be in China. So one of my language teachers at Harvard, I was a Brown graduate, but I took classes at Harvard, and one of my teachers, I told everybody, I want to go live in China, and people kind of scratched their head and said, are you sure? Why? And I just had this bee in my bonnet, that this was something I was destined to do. So in March of 1980, I found myself in Beijing, working at the Foreign Languages Press, which is the publishing arm of the government. They publish magazines, books in foreign languages for distribution around the world, and to the diaspora in China. And I was working in the book section, and I spent the next almost year and a half in Beijing, living in a dormitory. It was the Waiwenju Foreign Languages Press dormitory. And it was an interesting time, and my status was interesting too, because, as you probably know, during the 50s, the Russians came into China in a big way, and they built a lot of buildings and a lot of hotels, and they built things to accommodate the large Russian presence. So the Friendship Hotel was built then, and the Friendship Store was built then. There was a Moscow restaurant that had borscht. And so there were still the remnants of that foreign expert system, but with people like me, they brought in those that they wouldn't have to pay foreign expert salaries. They paid us in local currency, and they treated us sort of halfway as Chinese, halfway as foreigners. So I was living in a dormitory with a lot of local Chinese and some foreigners. So we had this kind of weird in-between status. And there were actually very few people of Chinese descent who lived in China at the time. So I was immediately seen as being a local. Like I thought my challenge would be to blend in. It was just the opposite. And I learned the hard way when I was seen on the street with a Westerner. One particular case that is still emblazoned in my mind. I knew no one in Beijing at the time, but I had some friends of friends of friends, and I knew some students at Peking University that were from Stanford. And one of them, whose name is Frank Hawk, was...
We have interviewed him.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about Frank Hawk, because that really was memorable. I had just arrived, and somebody said, oh, my friend Frank Hawk is there, you should get together with him. So we somehow made contact. I can't even remember how we did this. There was one phone in the entire Waiwunji complex, so it must have been through that. I don't even know. But he said somehow a message came through like, I'm going to come pick you up on my bicycle. We're going to go to Tiananmen because it's the Qingmingjie, the tomb sweeping day. And we'll just go hang out. And I was like, that sounds great. I literally arrived in Beijing like a week or two earlier. Just thought, what a fun thing to do, you know. So he showed up. Frank then, I don't know if he still does, very long hair, where he had a very distinct wardrobe of like blue bell-bottom blue jeans and cowboy boots, and then a Mao jacket and mustache. You know, he really looked like a classic American, and then wearing a Mao jacket. And he had been living in Beijing at the time for almost a year, studied Chinese because, again, he came with the first wave in '79. So he knew a lot of slang. So here I'm on the back of his bicycle, you know, and we're going to Tiananmen Square, and it's actually quite full. I mean, Tiananmen, if you haven't actually been to a place like Tiananmen Square, it's hard to capture how vast it is. It's, you know, goes on for seemingly miles, and it was mobs of people, and a lot of the people there are part of a work unit or part of a school or they're all in formation, and they have flags, and you know, a lot of kids with white shirts and bandanas, and just the whole place is filled. But there was a scattering of people, or smattering of people, I should say, who are not part of a work unit. And at the time, they had an unflattering title called like Xiao Liumang, little scoundrels, because they didn't have a work unit and they didn't have school. It was just, you know, the Cultural Revolution had destroyed the whole system. And they were putting it all back together, but there were a lot of people kind of left in the dust. You know, they didn't have a place to go to. And Frank, in his inimitable American way, started chatting with them. And he knew a lot of Beijing slang at that point. One in particular, which sent them into gales of laughter, was Gai Lamar. And it meant cover the hat. You know, it was just a very popular expression. And he would say these things, and you know, people started surrounding us. They were laughing their heads off, and they're like, sing a song, dance, do this. And soon a mob had surrounded us, like a huge mob of people, to the point where there were a lot of people that wanted to see what's going on, but they couldn't even see. The mob was so big. They were sort of, the bodies were getting thrown up against the crowd. And I fell to my hands and knees because the crowd was swaying back and forth, and I fell to my hands and knees. And I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? I was like, I might get trampled to death right here in the middle of Tiananmen Square. And then at some point, someone, we figured it was a plainclothes policeman, came and sort of parted the crowd. And Frank and I just like ran out of there. You know, it was a little bit frightening. We ran to the Peking Hotel down the road, right at the end of Tiananmen Square. I was like, wow, that was an experience. But it was a very friendly crowd. It just happened to get a little out of control. So what I learned months and months later is that I was being followed from that point. I was so conspicuous, you know, understandably. They thought I was local Chinese. What was I doing with this white American who, you know, all of this. And later the foreign languages press had organized a dance, and it was a weekend, so they still didn't. So they were following me that whole weekend because they couldn't find out from the office until the Monday who I was, what was going on, and then they found out that I was actually an American citizen. But that whole incident, I just remember so clearly because so much, I learned so much from that day. And what I subsequently experienced after that was that every time I was seen with a foreigner, or I tried to go to the friendship store or the Peking Hotel, whatever, I would get stopped, and they would say, "Who are you? Nina, who are you? Who are you looking for? What are you doing here?" And so it was like a constant thing. Like I just got to the point where it was so inconvenient. I was like, okay, I'm just going to be Chinese, because they just clearly, it was going to be easier, for me to get around that way. And so that really marked that period where I just went through this whole identity crisis, a little bit of identity crisis in America, but now again in China, because I didn't also feel entirely Chinese. My Chinese at the time was okay, but not great, and then suddenly I'm in almost being encouraged to just hang out with Chinese. So, but over time, over the months, I got more and more comfortable. I was like, oh, well, this is a better way to live in China, is to be Chinese. I can go anywhere and be inconspicuous. I met a young man who was a writer, and then he introduced me to other writers, and then I met artists and filmmakers and musicians and whatnot.
I saw some of the pictures.
Yes.
I mean, you met some amazing people.
Yes, I did. So that comes a little bit later. Mm-hmm. So in that period, it was just the beginning of my discovery of the creative environment in China. And I saw a few films that were made at the time, and some television shows. And I was so stunned and delighted and just thrilled when I saw Chinese people for the first time on screen in front of and behind the camera, because I'd never experienced that in America. So I was like, oh, we are three-dimensional characters. And even though the films were not traveling and they were maybe not what I was used to seeing, but just the delight of seeing Chinese actors and a creative spirit running through the people I met, I just was so attracted to that.
I read a quote by you that said you as a child growing up had never imagined that it could be possible that Chinese and Asians could be artists.
Exactly. I never had a creative conversation with anyone who was Asian, never saw any works. We were invisible on screen. So my takeaway from that was, I want to figure out a way to bring more of Chinese culture, especially through films, because I thought that would be the best way to give people an impression of thank you.
Then tell me how that happened.
So that happened. So I came back from China in 1981 and 1982 without having any idea of how I was going to parlay any of my experience into work. I ended up going to business school, but what I started to do during that time was host Chinese film screenings. So it'd be going to the Chinese consulate in New York, which is on 42nd Street and 12th Avenue. And at the time, the films were all in 35mm prints, these very, very heavy film canisters. And I'd sort of carry them to somewhere and get on the subway, and where I found a screening room. And so I was so interested in the Chinese films that were starting to come out then. Not yet. I can't remember when Chen Kaige's Huang Tu Di, Yellow Earth, came out, but that was a film that really shook the world. So while I was doing that, I met other people also interested in Chinese film. They were also borrowing prints, and there was a group in San Francisco that I made contact with who said they had a theater up there, and they were interested in showing Chinese films. And when I graduated, they hired me. And I had this little piece of paper that said I'm somehow knowledgeable about business, and all my other classmates at Columbia were going to work at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or whatever, and I just knew I didn't want to do that. And so this was the one job that truly, I feel just so blessed. It was the one job I wanted and was qualified for.
Okay, give me a little bit more details on that. You said Yellow Earth was very influential. Did you bring Chen Kaige and Zhang Yimou over?
So now I'm situated in San Francisco. So this is where a lot of that work then it really begins in earnest. Because before I was just doing it casually on my own. Now I'm running a company called World Entertainment, and our specific mandate is to distribute and exhibit Chinese films. So now I'm officially in touch with the China film organizations and officials and filmmakers. So now I'm flying back to China to look at the new Chinese films coming up. And it was the film Yellow Earth that became a bit of a sensation. You probably know Kaige and Zhang Yimou were part of the so-called fifth generation filmmakers that were being supported by Wu Tianming in the Xi'an film studio. Wu Tianming was also making his films, another filmmaker named Tian Zhuangzhuang. So this is the core of the fifth generation filmmakers. And they were making films that I found extraordinary. Zhang Yimou started out as a cinematographer for Chen Kaige. And I remember in particular Yellow Earth being just so stunning, and just said, okay, this is a commercially viable, in the sense of it being very artistic. I had a sense that it would do very well at film festivals, and we showed it at our theater in San Francisco. So yes, that's when I started bringing Chinese officials and Chinese filmmakers to film festivals. I would be submitting the various films to festivals, and it was the beginning. It's such a beautiful period, honestly, of being able to introduce China and the film industry. Like, there was a lot of ignorance about China, and certainly people didn't even think about a film industry. So it was kind of a process of discovery, and it was in that period that I met Jeff Gilmore, who was running UCLA Film Archives, Tom Leddy, who was running Pacific Film Archives at Berkeley, and Richard Pena was in Chicago. He was showing the Chicago Art Institute. So these films were primarily being shown at museums and schools and places like that. But also we had a theater and a kind of a loose theatrical circuit. So I couldn't be more happy doing what I was doing. And again, having so much contact with the Chinese filmmakers. And then later, I was able to bring studio executives over. So in one period, again, I was finding Chinese films to show in North America. And then somebody contacted me one day who was at Universal Studios. And Universal at the time was owned by MCA, which was a talent management company. And he had the foresight to say that the Chinese film industry, he thought, and the whole market was going to blow up. So this is mid-80s still, probably 1985. And so he hired me to come down to Los Angeles and represent Universal and Paramount MGM-UA, which is the consortium of studios that shared international distribution. He said, let's carve out, because we had an organization that was technically doing distribution, but they pretty much ignored China. They didn't really know at the time, whether China was worthwhile. But this one gentleman named Skip Paul, who to this day is a friend and mentor, saw the potential, and he said, I want to carve out China and see what we can do, separately from the rest of the organization. So I started now flying back and forth to China representing American films, and we chose several of the first films that were distributed in China for the very first time, studio films. Previously, there had been a couple of films. It was Rambo, I know, was distributed, which did very well. There was also a film called Nightmare in Badham County, which was a cable movie about a white and African-American women who travel to the South and get beat up and kidnapped, and all sorts of terrible things happen, but it became a huge sensation.
Wow.
So they were really starving for movies, and so now I was able to bring the first American movies, studio movies. The first one, yeah?
It sounded like there was also appetite among the studio crowd for producing in China. I mean, I found this one picture of you bringing Cubby Broccoli over.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So during this period, I was now flying back and forth to China, introducing American films. The first films that we brought over were like Roman Holiday, and then we did a whole retrospective of Gregory Peck's work, and he came over to China. That was a thrilling experience. A lot of people, the elite people in the film industry in China, remember these moments. We had screenings of new films like Out of Africa. Love Story is one of the films, Spartacus. Anyway, and I was also kind of being this liaison. Even before I took this job at Universal, I think, I get some of the time frames mixed up, but in that basic period, I was taking a number of people over to China. The Broccoli's came over to scout to see if maybe they would want to shoot in China. So we had a wonderful experience. Studs Terkel was there. So
Wow.
so I took Studs Terkel around China. So I met so many wonderful people at the time. And Studs was interesting. He said, I came to China thinking I would write a book. And after 2 weeks, I know I can't write a book. I can maybe do a couple of radio shows. He said China is so complex and so deep.
Well, let's explain for people who don't know Studs Terkel. He's a Chicago workers' rights writer
Yes.
personality, and he's coming to a place that is technically the workers' paradise.
Exactly. He wrote a book called Working and many others that were very, very popular. He was really, a champion for the people, for proletariat in China, they would say. In Chinese it's workers, peasants, soldiers, 工农兵. And so he was fascinated, but then he realized that China is so deep. And I think many people, China scholars, would agree that it's so big and complex and deep. It's really hard to sum it up in any way that's very quickly digestible. So anyway, so that was the period where there was a lot of back and forth. It was very exciting. And I'm in my office at Universal one day, and Steven Spielberg's producer called Kathy Kennedy. She now runs Lucasfilm. And she said, we know that you're flying back and forth to China a lot, and Steven is interested in directing a movie there. I'm like, bing, bing, bing. So they sent a little golf cart over to my office, because they're in the back lot, Universal, and I had this meeting with Kathy, and she said, yes, Steven's really fascinated by this book that J.G. Ballard wrote called Empire of the Sun, and we're developing a script, and we'd really like to shoot in Shanghai, because there's no substitute for Shanghai. So my then boss, Skip Paul, blessedly encouraged me. He said, I felt bad. I was like, Skip, I'm being offered this opportunity. He's like, absolutely, you should take it. And, that's why mentorship is so important, because we want our mentees to grow. And so I kind of left that position and ended up working on this gargantuan movie that shot in 1986. I'm pretty sure. I think I started. All the dates get blurred because so much happened in those few years. And suddenly I find myself in Shanghai, liaising with the main film officials in China. At the time, there was something called the Co-Production Corporation. Of course, we were being assigned a partner. That would be the Shanghai Film Studios, naturally. And, China at the time was definitely opening up, but it was still very centrally controlled. And which in many ways made it easier for us, because I was aware that if we got permissions from the very top, and apparently it did go to the very top, to the State Council of Guoyuan, and once they approved, then the trickle-down effect would be that a lot of people would comply. These days, it would be extremely difficult to shut down the city of Shanghai, as we more or less did. It would involve so many different individual proprietors and vendors and whatnot. Also, needless to say, Shanghai has changed so much. To recreate Shanghai of the 30s and 40s today would be very, very difficult. But Shanghai back in the mid-80s was not that different from Shanghai of 40, 50 years earlier. So the timing was really interesting, because they were open. They had really good film crews already. China already, as I knew, they had a pretty robust film industry. There were some really big. There was the Steven Spielberg of China at the time was named Xie Jin, and
I think I have his picture.
I got to know him quite well, and we did that. That's him, and two greats together.
Yeah.
We did. I remember in my previous work, I had done a retrospective of Xie Jin's work in America. So a lot of things were coming together in such a beautiful way, and this job of delivering Shanghai in the way Steven foresaw it, wanted it to portray on screen was, a pretty big task. Because it was, if you've seen the movie, it was a giant evacuations, tons of people escaping Shanghai, and we needed a lot of extras, probably close to 10,000, to fill the screen. Back then, there was no CGI; we couldn't paint them in, and it was just a massive operation to to shut down parts of the city. I'm pretty sure back in the day they told people don't go to work, don't, everybody got time off. They gave us cars that had a siren on top, so as if we were police, because for the traffic and just housing and clothing the extras, and then getting the Chinese crews to work with the American and British crews that went over, and just doing something that had never been done before in Shanghai.
I was going to ask you about exactly that, because these Chinese filmmakers that you were working with, Shanghai Film Corporation, they have been shooting propaganda stuff. They were a Dunway, a work unit, right? The art served a purpose, served the state. And now you were coming in and shooting something entirely different. What was that like?
It was fascinating. I mean, yes, they did have to approve the script. First of all, this was not an official co-production, but what they called an assisted production. The difference being with the co-production, you get investment from China, and the film is released in China as a Chinese film. And so the censorship is a little stricter. This was an assisted production, meaning we were bringing we did not need any funding from China, and this was a Warner Brothers movie that would be released internationally as an American film and not a Chinese film. I don't think it was officially released in China. They did look at the script, and I remember some of the changes were really just about the descriptions. It didn't affect the actual shooting and the dialogue. There were some descriptions of, prostitutes or beggars in Shanghai, and they just asked us to remove some of that. We did, I think, portray Shanghai in a pretty authentic way, but we didn't need to underscore.
That authenticity really struck me, because there are scenes where you have a building in Shanghai with a picture of Chen Kaige on it, which of course is accurate because the Kuomintang were in charge of Shanghai at the time.
Yes.
But you're working with the other side.
Yes. Well, it's, we're portraying, it's a movie, so you're portraying Shanghai in the way that it should be at the time. We had I think it was it Gone with the Wind? We had one of the big cinemas that was, on the marquee was Gone with the Wind. So we obviously dressed it to look like that. But again, we had such strong basic ingredients because the buildings had not changed that much. And the experience was incredible. It was many, many, many months of pre-production, first working through permitting, and then bringing equipment in, and then getting visas for personnel, and then deciding. We basically hired Public Security Bureau people and the firefighters and police. We needed so many extras. We took whole giant work units to work for us, and I think it was an incredible experience. And then when Steven arrived, I was pretty much stuck by, in a good way, stuck. Kathy said, "You do not leave Steven's sight." Like, I was helping him interpret or relay questions and requests and whatnot. So I suddenly found myself in this unbelievable position to be with one of the greatest living directors in China, on this set in Shanghai, where my father was born. And I just thought, it just doesn't get better than this. I mean, who knew that my meandering thoughts about profession would come down to this, that, my love of movies and my experience in China would allow me to contribute meaningfully to a production in China with Steven and with Kathy and Frank. And I just thought, okay, it doesn't get better than this. So, one of the first things I did was, I knew it was really important to have bilingual, bicultural people. So again, there was this new crop of Chinese students that were studying film in America at UCLA, USC, whatnot. So I immediately sucked them up, grabbed them. I was like, okay, I hired a bunch of people that would basically be, again, understood film, could be bilingual. So in each of the production departments, there was a group of people who were bilingual and bicultural. Yeah, it turned out to be an incredibly wonderful experience. Steven was very, very happy, and that was when I truly understood that film is a universal language. Like, without speaking the actual language, there was a lot of understanding. I remember the very well-known production designer who came to China, and we introduced him to some of the best production designers in China, and he was so impressed with the work. He's like, I don't even need to be here. Like, I'm going to go to England and Spain where the rest of the shoot was. He said they know so much more about Chinese, the props needed and the production design, how things should look. He's like, he's so experienced. I'm basically handing the full responsibility of the Shanghai portion to him. And, wonderful costume designers and prop masters, people who really knew China. So to be able to draw from the talent pool in China for this movie was really so gratifying. Mm-hmm. Around the same time, Bernardo Bertolucci was shooting The Last Emperor in Beijing. And he, again, because China was so welcoming of foreign filmmakers at the time, he was able to shoot right in the Forbidden City, which would be very, very difficult today. And so he was having a great experience there, again, with a mix of foreign and Chinese crew. And so these two huge productions were happening almost simultaneously, really putting China on the map as a fantastic location for filmmakers. Both of them had very positive things to say about working in China. So it was a very, very, very special period where there was a lot of hope and optimism about what was possible between China and other nations, even beyond film, but particularly with these two films making it a very enticing place. So that was...
Yeah, I'm very interested because I saw many behind-the-scenes photos of the actors, all of them who had been the first time in China, probably. Christian Bale, of course. But I saw John Malkovich run around with a little camera around his neck the whole time.
Yes, yes.
What was their impression? What was their...
No, I think everyone was just fascinated. It was John Malkovich and Joey Pantaleone. Everybody was just fascinated. There wasn't that much to do in terms of recreations, but we all just enjoyed observing Shanghai life. We'd go out to eat at these little, restaurants in some alley somewhere, and it was a very unique experience in every way. And China at the time, it was there was a certain innocence. Because they were coming out of the Cultural Revolution. I think many people who experienced China in the 80s have a lot of 怀念. We're all very nostalgic in a way for that period. It was a very unique period. The combination of that movie and also working and living at the Foreign Languages Press, which was made up of a lot of either overseas Chinese or even foreigners who decided to go back to China to live because they wanted to help build the revolution, and very unique group of people. Their mindset was like, we really believe in China's future. We want to help build it up, and very friendly. And again, China had come through a very, very difficult period, so there was a lot of optimism about the future, a lot of curiosity, and not knowing where things were going. So it made for, we were all kind of aware that this was a new phase of China, kind of a pioneering phase, but nobody knew what the parameters were. So everybody was sort of testing the boundaries. How far can we go? There was a group of artists that started something called 星星美展, the arts star group. I think it was called Star Group, the Star Arts Group or something, and they put up exhibits, and then maybe they'd get shut down, but they put up, many of those artists became extremely well known later, and their works selling for multi-million dollars. So it was the birth of a creative spirit. The young writer I mentioned was part of something called Literature of the Wounded, the 伤痕文学. So it's like talking about the experience of the Cultural Revolution, in music, in film, in theater, in every way. It was just blossoming, and it was a little bit of a departure from what was prescribed earlier. And there was a lot of creative energy. And again, for me, I was particularly drawn to the filmmakers who were, again, pioneers and experimenting. It's like, can we show this? And it was really testing boundaries. It was, Deng Xiaoping era. So for Chinese that I met then too, they have a certain nostalgia for that period, because there was something about what we call rinqing, where like the feeling of humanity and the togetherness and the bonding, and we came through this together. We survived, and now we're going to thrive. So it was really a quite a special period. I just remember so many times going to, checking into my hotel, Peking Hotel or whatever, one of the new hotels that were opening up. And there was such curiosity, and they would say, tell us about America. And like, how's Chen Zhong? Chen Zhong is a friend of mine, Joan Chen, and she was a big star that left China in the early 80s. And they were so fascinated. It's like, how's she doing? Like, there was this feeling like one of our own, there was intense curiosity and, some feeling of like it would be nice to go abroad, but really a very special period before capitalism took hold. Though it was during that period also where they they announced the first Chinese capitalist company. Rongyiren was declared the first capitalist, and he started CITIC, which is now a giant organization. But so again, experimenting, and I found it even in my work with the Foreign Languages Press. We want to be commercial. We want to do this. So again, a lot of exploring, and then again with these films coming out, both Chinese films also gaining recognition, but also with these foreign filmmakers, there was such a feeling of like, oh my God, we are in this together. Like, America and China really can be allies and collaborators. And so, of course, I thought, well, I will just do China and Hollywood for the rest of my life. But that was not to happen.
We talked to quite a few Chinese artists who moved to New York in those days.
Yes.
Zhang Huang, Gu Wenda.
Yeah.
Yes. Artists like that. But what was the experience that Chen Kaige and Zhang Yimou had? Did they go abroad? Did they go to festivals?
They did go abroad. They went to festivals. I remember taking them to the Telluride Film Festival, which is one of my favorite. It's a very cozy festival, but very, very, all the filmmakers are quite accessible. It's in the mountains. There's no awards or no red carpet. So everybody's a film lover, a filmmaker. And I remember Wu Tianming, Tom Luddy took us on a horseback riding expedition. Wu Tianming just like took off. He's such a wild one. He just like galloped ahead, and everybody's like, oh my God, where'd he go? What's going to happen? We lost a Chinese filmmaker. And Kaige and Zhang Yimou, and I was able to first also bring in a lot of the studio executives to China. So that was also a thrill, because, again, after such a long separation, decades of where Chinese filmmakers might fantasize one day I'll meet the head of Universal Studios, but and then it's happening, and the vice versa, like, oh, these emerging filmmakers. Yeah, Kaige was also he actually stayed with me in my house in LA for periods of time. And
I would be amiss to not ask about your family, because they had left and you had gone back. And this was also before anyone really knew how big China and China film would become. So what were we?
So, yeah, that's very interesting. My parents, when I was growing up, of course, they wanted me to be very Chinese. They were trying to preserve Chinese culture. And Jiao Ai, all their friends, we had no relatives, but they had a lot of Chinese friends, and I had to be polite, bow, and make sure I was like serving other people and doing all these Chinese customs. And they were like, and hopefully you'll marry Chinese. And I was like, where are they? I'm looking around, I don't see any Chinese. And they, being the youngest of three, I had a little more leeway, but I literally had no idea. I mean, I knew what my interests were, but I never imagined in a million years that I could actually work in the film business or do anything creative. It just didn't seem like an option. I never had any role models. I never saw anybody that did that. So, I was bumbling along, and then even when I declared Chinese studies my major, my father in particular was so concerned. He's like, well, where's that going to lead? There's no job, right? And I was like, I don't know, but I'm just curious. I want to, So it's just ironic that they weren't in favor of my studying Chinese after they wanted me to be Chinese. And then when I went to Beijing, they also thought, why is she doing that? But they, at that point, realized they had not too much control over me. I was very stubborn. I was just going to do what I wanted. And then it grew, I think the first thing that they noticed was when I learned Chinese more fluently, I just got to know them a lot better. I became so much more curious about their own backgrounds. I think they really appreciated that. I would start asking them stories like, when you grew up, what was it like? What was the relatives? So I think they appreciate it because, we never, up until a time, I would say we three of us children, never really knew much about or exhibited much curiosity about China and their past. And suddenly all these stories started coming out, and I just kept asking them more and more, and I actually recorded a lot of them with my father and mother. And so I'm sure they were very happy about that. Then when I started at MCA Universal, they were like, oh, okay, so that's a big corporation. They understood. It was like 17,000 employees, stock options, whatever. So they understood that. But then later, when I joined Oliver Stone, they were like, oh, why did she leave that big corporate? So it was always a lot of, the thing that changed was when the Joy Luck Club came out, and it was the first studio movie in a long, long time, if ever, to, have, telling a Chinese-American story. All their friends knew about it. They were extras in the movie, along with other family members. And so they suddenly understood, oh, okay, well, they had bragging rights. They had bragging rights. So that helped a lot, and then they just kind of left me alone after that. But it was during the 80s, my parents did come over for a trip, and, we were able to travel around China and continue the journey that we started in the 70s, seeing relatives. And, it was just fascinating to see. In the 70s, when we went back to China, we asked them, what can we bring? And they said, we need flour, we need rice, we need, cloth, cotton, because everything was rationed at the time. And is it rationed or rationed? Both. And so that's what they were asking for. Then in the 80s, like, oh, can you bring a television set? Can you bring it became, as China was modernizing, the requests changed over time. But I remember even in the 70s when I went there, they would go through my toiletry bag and say, what's this? Was that my contact lens solution or like a shower? Like they hadn't seen so many things. And then in the 80s, it started to change, and they became more fascinated with kind of some Western goods. And so and then look at China today. Everyone wants to buy Chinese goods.
I'm fascinated by what you're telling me about the early days of filmmaking in China. And I wonder if you could compare a little bit to me the situation, the challenges of making films in China over the different decades. I mean, you did Empire of the Sun, you did Joy Luck Club, of course, in 1993. You did Shanghai Calling,
yes,
right, which was 2001.
2010, I think. 2010.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
But these were almost different countries.
They were. Those three movies I shot part of a movie called Dark Matter with Meryl Streep and a big star, Liu Ye, shot partially in Beijing. And also I did a movie for Disney called High School Musical, Chinese High School Musical, which was that and Shanghai Calling were shot entirely on location in Shanghai with a large Chinese crew. They were really some of my favorite experiences. I mean, I seem to have shooting in Shanghai in my destiny because I hope to shoot more in Shanghai. It's a wonderful city with incredible locations. Yeah, no, so much change. As I was saying when we were shooting Empire of the Sun, when things were very centrally controlled, we just had to get permission from the very top and the word would trickle down. So, once those approvals were given, then everything else fell in line, more or less. The next time with Joy Luck Club, it started to change because we had to go to individual proprietors. And then even later, Dark Matter was, I think, 2005-ish. That was a wonderful experience. We didn't shoot the whole movie here, but a good chunk of it. And it was very, very much like shooting an indie film anywhere. We could hire, whoever we wanted. Because back then, with Empire of the Sun, obviously we worked through Shanghai Film Studio. Fortunately, they had the best personnel anyway. And having their support was so, necessary.
But with a Dunway, you had to take who they gave you.
Yeah, we had some choice, but we had to work with that studio. But we needed that studio. We needed a big, gorilla behind us to get things done. When I shot Dark Matter here, it was completely different. It was again an assisted production, but we could just hire individual. And there were quite a few good people that we were able to hire. And then with High School Musical, we had 2 Chinese partners. One was Shanghai Media Group, Shanghai Wenguang, and one was Huayi Brothers. It was pretty much all Chinese crew and Chinese cast. We had to find people who could sing and dance and act, and it was just fun to see a lot of the emerging talent, and some of them were really incredible. And then with Shanghai Calling, a similar situation. It was also, that one was actually official co-production, and but again, we were able to hire more or less who we wanted. So all individuals, there's a lot of private companies now, and so we didn't have to work through, we had a partner, China Film Group, but in terms of hiring of crew and cast, it was, again, just like making an indie film. Locking down locations also became more difficult because we had to go to, again, individual store owners, proprietors, and whatnot, and we couldn't officially shut down the Bund, but we did shoot there in both cases. I've shot on the Bund now 4 times, which is unbelievable. But in the case of Shanghai Calling, I remember we didn't shut it down. We just shot whoever was there and made it part of it. And same thing with High School Musical, as I recall, or maybe we were able to shut down just a portion of it.
I don't know if you know this, but Empire of the Sun in particular has had a really lasting impact here also in Shanghai. Just a couple of months ago, I spotted a YouTube video where a gentleman went to all the locations to show what they look like today.
Oh.
I've seen screenings of small groups still. People are still looking back to that.
Oh.
How do you look back onto the film now?
Nothing short of life-changing for me. It was when I realized, this is what I want to do, number one. I could specifically identify, I want to be a producer. This is like, you get to have a say in what's seen on screen. And I was like, God, it just doesn't get better. Just being a helper to Steven at the time gave me such a bird's eye view of what it's like to work on a big production. And I was just, I learned so much from Kathy Kennedy and how organized a film production needs to be, and everybody having specific roles. And, I just learned from the best right off the bat. So I would say each decade that I've lived, there's been that experience that really popped, as in the 80s, that movie. I know there's a documentary of making of behind the scenes, and I think to Steven, it's also when I see him, we talk about it, was very, very, very special to him. And there's so many moments. There was one moment where we were shooting. It was cold, it was rainy, and there were a lot of extras, and they were trying to do a bunch of different shots, both wide angle and then more close up, and the extras didn't understand why. We have to do this again. We have to do this again. I was like, Steven, they're getting really tired and they're grumbling. He's like, gather everybody in a building. We went inside a church, and he just gave this beautiful speech. He said, "You are my heroes. I could not make this without you." I was translating for him, and he really understood what it takes. It's the same everywhere. People want to be respected, and after he gave that speech, everybody was re-energized, and they understood how important they were, and every person, every crew member, every cast member, and every extra, everyone's important to that. And I think it was a reminder, that's the common language when you work in film, is how it's all a team effort. So,
it is.
Yeah, it brought tears to my eyes to think that he just instantly understood what was required in the moment.
How did the Chinese side, the Chinese partners, feel after Empire of the Sun came out?
Oh, I think they were so proud. Again, I don't think the film was officially, because Warner Brothers actually, ironically, was not part of this Universal Paramount MGM-UA consortium, so Warner's had a separate distribution system. I don't think it was officially distributed. I know it was talked about a lot and probably seen somehow or the other, and I know at the Shanghai Film Studios, I'm told, I haven't been to their studio in a bit, but they still have pictures of us on the walls. And, it was a historic moment for so many of us, really, for Steven and for China and for the film industry and, what was possible in being able to capture, that period in such an authentic way. And I think the aspiration for so many of us still is to find opportunities to do more co-productions and to put China on the screen in a big way. And ideally, now that the China market is so enviably large, to find stories that would resonate on, both sides of the Pacific. And I know I still have this aspiration myself.
What were the most important China films in America? Was it Crouching Tiger? Was it Empire?
Empire of the Sun is very, very well respected. We recently showed it at the Academy Museum. And I was able to introduce it and talk about my experience working on it, which was really fun. Last Emperor got a lot of, as you know, Academy nominations and awards, so that was obviously a big thing and put Joan Chen and John Lone on the map in a big way. So I think that was quite influential. And then, of course, we know after 1989, things, the whole atmosphere cooled on China quite a bit. So nothing much, in fact, several movies came out in the 90s that China deemed unfriendly, like Kundun and 7 Years in Tibet and Red Corner, and it was just weird how quickly things turned. It was shocking, actually. But then in the 2000s, things started warming up towards the Olympics, 2008, and Crouching Tiger, I think, came out at a critical time, 2001. It was, is that right? 9/11, 2000. Because I remember I was invited back to China, I think it was 2001, and it was weird because it was right after 9/11, and 9/11 happened in 2001, I think it might have, and it was November of 2001, and a couple of things had happened in that year. 9/11 happened, and I was at the LAX airport, and it was empty. I've never seen an airport so empty, because very few people were flying, very few people dared to fly.
Yeah.
And I was invited to come back to consult on a media company, and I arrived in China not having spent much time there in the 90s. I was back and forth a lot in the 80s, not much at all in the 90s. Suddenly I was there in 2001, and it had really woken up in a big way. It was very lively, it was very colorful, very fun, and there were just signs of lightness that I had never experienced before in China. I'd always been very subdued, and so suddenly, kids are running around, and there's entertainment and music and films and theater, and a very commercially malls opening up and things just happening that were people were out and about, and even the government officials I met with them, they were joking around and just being it was a side of China I had not seen. And America was depressed. So there's been a weird seesaw effect I've noticed over the years. I don't know if it's coincidental or what, but America was in a very, very, very depressed place, and China seemed to have really come alive. And then that was the same year Crouching Tiger came out, which was initially intended as a Chinese film. It was in the Chinese language, and they thought, was Chinese investors primarily. Sony Classics picked it up for the world, but everyone thought, this is a movie for China. It was Ang Lee, making a film that was used distinctly Chinese elements, martial arts and whatnot. And everybody thought it was going to blow up in China, and it was actually just the reverse. It blew up outside of China. China did apparently okay, but they were like, this is nothing that new for us. And even though it was in the Chinese language, it was a huge, 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 huge hit. I think Sony Classics is still reaping the benefits of that. And it kind of, in my mind, gave Chinese filmmakers a wonderful genre to explore that was very commercial, also very well respected, but very uniquely Chinese. And after that, I know Zhang Yimou and Kaige and many other Chinese filmmakers started making more martial arts films, and that helped really create more income for the Chinese film industry. And, Taiwan, Hong Kong filmmakers as well. But so there were quite a few films that came out in that 2000 some period that were martial arts films. And again, that sold well abroad, particularly to other parts of Asia. So China was developing its, a more robust film industry. There was another film that came out, was it 2012, that really blew my mind. It was Xu Zheng's movie called Taijiong, Lost in Thailand. And it was a comedy, dramedy. It was a funny film about a guy who loses his passport and having to run around. Anyway, and it was made for, a few million, and it made over $100 million. And then the Chinese box office was like $1 billion. And that's when the studios really started taking notice. So 2000s, I think people started warming up to China in general. But I see, and with Crouching Tiger and with other Chinese films, they're like, oh, there's some stuff really going on here. But that 2012 period on for the next 10, 15 years was when a lot of studios and investors started saying, oh, we got to get back into China. China's really happening now. And that was a period where there was, I used to organize a conference every year through Asia Society where I'd bring Chinese companies over and filmmakers, and all the studios would show up, and everybody, there was so much investment, so many, if you look at the films that were made in that period, you see so many Chinese names in the executive producer credits, because there was so much. China was making a lot of money and was cash rich, and Hollywood was not so cash rich, so almost all the studios were making deals with Chinese companies to co-invest and co-produce, and a lot of Chinese companies were investing again in studios, and then companies like Wanda where they bought Legendary, and so there was a lot of activity in that period from 2012 all through even starting earlier 20 whatever through like 2000 that period up until about 2018, there was it was again a very high. It was like it's been different plateaus, and that was a very high plateau of activity with tons of so many people going back and forth and feeling American films playing very well in China, a lot of Chinese investment in American films and American companies, a lot of desire to do co-productions. I mean, everybody was bubbling with excitement about how Hollywood and China could work together again, and now not so.
Temporary.
It's temporary. It's all temporary.
You were talking about the ups and downs, back and forth. What was the toughest day?
It's really been a heartbreak at times. 1989. After all this incredible experience that so many of us had, it was just like, oh, okay, now, just everything just turned on a dime. And then it happened again in around 2018, 2019. After so much activity, so much collaboration, there was a lot of dating, a lot of engagement, and some marriages. And then suddenly, nope, got a divorce. And for me, just what fuels me is cross-cultural collaboration. I just find it very exciting. I'm motivated by humanizing underrepresented people on screen, and that often for so long was Asians. Fortunately, in America, a lot of Asian American content and now Asian content has been doing very well, not so much from China, but obviously Korea, Japan. Movies, shows, TV shows, explosion of Korean television and films. I mean, Squid Game, and then K-pop Demon Hunters, and the most recent Demon Slayers from Japan. So now there is just an incredible and wonderful surge of Asian, shows and movies and music. And I find it all very thrilling, but the fact that China is not a big part of the conversation is also heartbreaking to me. When China and America have a greater distance, then I find other ways to entertain myself, and they've, served me well. So in '89, that's when I started. I thought the whole time, I was like, oh, I'm just gonna work between China and Hollywood. And then '89, I was like, oh, that's not gonna happen. So I formed this company with Oliver Stone, and started producing movies of all kind. I mean, Jolla Club came out of that period, but most of the movies had nothing to do with China. And so I said, I have to learn how to be just a producer, not rely on China as being like a calling card. I'm just going to produce. And so that was a very wonderful period too. I made a lot of movies that I'm very proud of, and I was so appreciated that partnership with Oliver. And then when China started opening up again, I was invited back, as I mentioned, starting in 2001, and then made something in 2005, 2010, 12, around that period where so much was happening. I was like, oh, I can do this again. This is like the world's opening up in that way. And then, nope, sorry, that's not happening. Okay, let's pivot.
Actually, we talk a lot about the past, but one question about the future that I did want to ask you was, if there was a young you now, a young producer, filmmaker, would you still, given that the tastes have diverged so much, advise them to think of like, go to Hollywood, go to America, and vice versa? Or is it no longer?
I think my path is a little bit unique in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know too many other people who started in China, moved to Hollywood. And by the way, I was going to mention, when things shut down in China again, I found other ways to try to be productive. And then I got very involved with the Academy. And, I think if China were still a very viable place to work, who knows, I might have been spending more time in China, and I would not have had the opportunity, to get involved with the Academy and become president. So again, I have no regrets for myself. I couldn't possibly have any regrets. I think what I would say to someone starting out in the business today is, I think a lot of Asia is booming. If you have a particular, I'm driven, and I think most artists are driven by passion and not by what's practical and logical and reasonable, or, there's so much uncertainty. I couldn't possibly have imagined any of this happening, if I were doing what my parents wanted me to do, which is find a safe and sensible job. None of this would have been on my radar. But I think, there's always opportunity. There's always opportunity. It may not be, it's always changing too. The Hollywood that I grew up in is so different from the Hollywood it is today. Streamers and tech companies dominate. In China, Duanju is drawing a lot of people, YouTube. It's all changing, but there's always room for good storytelling.
But you mentioned just now things have changed so much, and one of the things that has changed is representation.
Yes. So in my world, in my little bubble, there's so much to be grateful for, and so much. I mean, I cannot even keep up. It used to be, if I saw a single Chinese actor or Asian actor in something or the other, I'd immediately be drawn to it and go, who's that person? That's incredible. Or if I saw someone in the room, there were so few people. For a long time, I was like the only Asian woman in in different rooms, right? And then there's just some funny stories, because then when new ones came up, they thought they would be called Janet or whatever. And so these days, oh my God, I have seen such an amazing explosion of a talent pool that is so, you need financial success, you need the emergence of talent, and you need good storytelling to create a hunger at the distribution level, obviously, right? And I think we've proven that there is that. And really, it started with Crazy Rich Asians, and then it's gone on, The Farewell and Minari and Parasite and Everything Everywhere sweeping the Oscars one year, and then Beef and Shogun sweeping the Emmys. And I mean, this is incredible. And now, K-pop Demon Hunters being the most watched movie ever on Netflix, and Demon Slayer just exploding at the box office. I mean, these are all unexpected.
It's such a huge change because we're all still used to white actors playing Asian roles because you needed a movie star, or even in Empire, all the speaking roles, almost all the speaking roles, were white people.
Yep.
When did that change?
I think it really changed. A lot of people give us credit for Joy Luck Club helping change the environment because it was the first studio-backed movie with an all-Asian cast. I know in the late 50s or early 60s was Flower Drum Song, so it's not really the first. I looked to that. But there hadn't been anything in a long time. And then it was 25 years until Crazy Rich Asians came out. And I'm glad that movie helped inspire, as I've been told, a lot. I talked to everyone from John Chu to like Mickey Lee. They're like, oh, that movie changed my life. So many people say it would change my life because I thought, oh, this is possible. But we didn't see evidence of that change for a long time. There were very, very few works. There are some things by Wayne Wang. There was, individual indie films that had come out. Justin Lin came out of that period, but really not a wave. And then somehow Crazy Rich Asians looked like it's a start. I don't know if it started a wave or the wave happened, coincidentally. But so much work has come out of that. Wonderful work, both on television and on the big screen. And, we are here to stay. I think there's no going back now.
You are mentioning the names of some really amazing filmmakers, and this connects to us very, very dearly because we started this project to ensure that the experiences and the achievements of so many Chinese and foreign citizens who came together and made all these accomplishments in the early years after China's reopenings are not forgotten. And what is it like for the filmmakers of that time? Do you see them appropriately honored in China but also abroad, or what is the situation?
I am sometimes disappointed that people have such short memories and short attention spans. I teach a class at LMU. I'm a presidential fellow at LMU, and many of the students who are film students haven't seen much work prior to the time they were born. It's disappointing, but at the same time, they are engaged, in other works, and I don't know. All we can do is treasure them. I did a Criterion Channel talk for Bawang Bieti, for Farewell My Concubine. And like that looks like it was from, I can't remember what year it came out exactly. These iconic works. I think for me, the film, and I was so privileged to run the Academy for those years because I realized the Oscars really does celebrate those works that stand the test of time. I think there's a lot of stuff out there these days, and young people are probably overwhelmed of, should I be watching this TikTok video or, a YouTube this or whatever, something on Netflix or a movie, But I think the movies that I most treasure are ones that I've seen in a theater and that I remember, that are not disposable. And there's a lot of content, I don't even like using that word, but I will, that's disposable. It's forgettable. It's like fast food. You see it, it gives you momentary pleasure, but you don't remember. It doesn't hang on. So it doesn't stay with you somehow. And I like being in the playground of making things that are meaningful and memorable. And I have personally witnessed how film has changed lives, dissolved borders, humanized, changed perceptions of people, created new bonds, friendships, and affected politics and economics and society in general. So, when I think back to the 80s, which is, I think, one of the focus of your documentary, that, it was really powerful when an elderly Chinese high official came up to me after a screening and said, "I have not seen an American movie since Greta Garbo." And, you know, this was such a meaningful experience, and it just gives us the opportunity to understand that the human condition is universal, because I think this is what films do best, sort of speaking from heart to heart. It's about experiences, and I like to say in this age of AI, the experiences that we have are not measurable with data, with algorithms. There's no metric to talk about joy or healing or grief or love. And I really hope that people remember this. There's many things that humans do that machines cannot do. And they are things that we treasure, and that even though we can't quantify what that is, they're still incredibly meaningful.
What a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.